Hi, welcome. My name is Terry Elton, and I'm here today with Pastor Aaron Fuller, and we're going to talk a little bit about what he can help us think about Christian public leader as we look through the lens of culture. Aaron is one of our graduates from Luther Seminary, both with an MDiv and a concentration in children and family. And Aaron, why are you wearing that outfit today? Why don't you tell us more about what you're doing now?
Well, 2013, I graduated and then was assigned to the Virginia Synod, and so that's where I served first call, two small congregations that were struggling, and but at the same time, I'd served about 9 years as a submarine officer before I went to seminary, and
Can you say that one more time? As a what kind of officer?
Submarine line officer.
Under the water, kind of.
Yeah, under the water, driving boats, shooting at things, yeah, all that good stuff.
Yeah.
So operate nuclear reactors, all that good stuff. So in the midst of seminary, some important people in my life in the Navy had said, well, Aaron, you should think about being a chaplain. And I thought I pretty much was done. But about midway through seminary, I started really feeling like I'm not done with the Navy. I don't feel like I'm done yet. And so I became a chaplain in Navy Reserve. So most of you understand that it's kind of the 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks out of the year, but from time to time, at least in the Navy Reserve, they will do what they call mobilize you to full-time active service. And so springtime, right around this time last year, about a year ago, I got a phone call from the head chaplain in Navy Reserve Forces Command and said, how would you like to mobilize? Which it was voluntary but not voluntary, and I thought I was going overseas and would have to spend a year away from Kelly because that's what most people do. And they said, well, how about Norfolk? So I applied, and 2 weeks later they said, you're the guy. So what I do now is I am the chaplain for people who individually deploy, and what that means is typically people go with a unit and they form together, they do all their training, so that it'd be like, the analogy would be like if we were going to send a whole congregation somewhere to do mission work overseas for a year, but you would do that with people that you know already. So it's really more like being an individual missionary. And so we have 3,500 people roughly who are around the world right now serving in these 1 year assignments, and they do it by themselves. So they might live in rural Minnesota or somewhere, and they get the same phone call, and within 6 months they are spending a whole year overseas somewhere in places like Afghanistan and Djibouti, Africa, and in Iraq and all over. And then they finish their year out, and then they go right back to civilian life. So, but they do this all by themselves. Their families are all by themselves. So a lot of the care is care in that transition, because as you can imagine, that whole year is one big transition. Things get normalized in that transition the way they wouldn't probably other ways. So a lot of ministry in times of crisis, a lot of quarterbacking ministry, because I'm one guy for 35.
Wow.
I like to tell people I became a mega church pastor. So
with people around the world.
Yeah. So, I kind of, having been 15 years in the service total, like I understand how it works, but it's much different as a chaplain. I'm not actually in charge of anything, which is great. There's something very freeing to not have to do all the things that I did as a parish pastor. Although they come up from time to time, like I made bulletins for a baptism I did like a month ago, so I was like, oh, glad I have that skill. But
love it.
But yeah, that's what I do now, and then it frees me up to support my colleagues in ministry in the church, because I'm stateside, so I supply preach, and I work on a committee in our synod that does work on raising awareness in our synod about diversity and inclusion and issues of justice happening in Virginia, which in the cradle of the South. Is an interesting conversation. It's not the same one that I think that happens in Minneapolis and St. Paul and in the Midwest.
Well, Aaron, let's go there. How is your passion for diversity and racism? Where did that come from? And in this course, as you know, you're one of our precept leaders. We're talking about what our the public call of the church to be in the world. right? And
Yeah.
as Christian public leaders. So talk about your own story a little bit, maybe of what brought you to care about those things.
Yeah. Well, as you can see, I am a Asian American male. I was adopted and Korean, but I grew up on a dairy farm in Minnesota. So I joke there are only two Asians in the ELCA, me and Paul Ertl up in Northwest Minnesota, who have very thick Minnesotan accents,
Which
and
is
are
pretty funny in and of itself.
right, with very very Scandinavian type names. So to be honest, the diversity thing got thrust on me. I'm one of 4 pastors in the synod that are people of color, and I get a lot of assumptions are made just because of how I look. But then there's the comfort that comes because I'm culturally a Minnesota dairy farmer. So, but you start realizing you can't really avoid who you are from your ethnic standpoint. And so, um, the part about it is that you start to become very conscious of it because of what people say and do. And there's some stories from my first call of just very, very prejudiced, racist comments made towards me. And, those are longer stories, but it raised my awareness that I need to start digging into my own history and past, and then thinking about a church I care about. And it's mainly kind of started from who gets excluded because of power dynamics, really. I'm always sort of keen on that. That's part of I'm an Enneagram 8, so it's all about the power, right? So, and if I don't have it, or people are trying to take it from me, right? So, so that it comes from that place. It comes from a place of understanding. So how is power being used to empower, or how is it being used to kind of oppress or limit? And I think that combined with sort of my own awakening about my own ethnic identity has kind of raised more of an awareness and a desire to work in like diversity and inclusion, because I say to myself, well, you created me this way, God, so I can't really step away from this. It's not going to go away, and I can continue to have kind of this weird feeling about it, or this gut reaction that I should do something, or I can just do something about it. That's the wrestler in me. So yeah.
So
Something about.
let me ask a couple questions here. So you are in many ways bicultural, or at least your community of northern Minnesota enculturated you, right, to rural agricultural life in Minnesota that has its particular things. And yet you were different, being adopted, and had some ethnicity differences with regard to that. You and I joke, Aaron is a big wrestler, and when he was here, was coaching, has continued to coach. And I said I was going to have a cross-cultural experience and go to a wrestling match. He had to even give me the language before I went. And with that, so I mean, part of what I see you as, Aaron, is a real translator, right? So talk about how you've been a bridge, maybe, and how do you become a bridge that's both aware of your own cultural stuff while you're also entering into being a guest in somebody else's culture and kind of working that back and forth?
Well, I can't claim. I think that's doing my work around like transracial adoptees, Korean adoptees. You can't claim an identity, so I can't really claim being fully white because I'm not, right. And I can't claim fully being Korean because if you stick me, well, hey, I remember being amongst the Korean international students, and I'm like, one of these things is not like the other, it's me, right? Right. Don't speak the language. I don't share, those norms. So my culture, or at least my cultural identity, has been formed in communities like wrestling. The church is another one. And I think there's always something to learn in those cultures, whether you're learning a new move, you're learning about different people and how they work. As a coach right now, I think that's probably where it really, in order to teach the sport of wrestling and get them to accomplish their goals, I have to constantly learn about what's going on from their life, what's going on at home, what's going on in school, girlfriends, relationships. I mean, this was true at Augsburg when I was coaching there too. All these things mix in and contribute to how they affect the person. And it's more than just on the surface wrestling. And to be more sensitive to those things or in tune with those things gives me the ability to be a better coach to them and to speak a language to them that they'll hear. Because, right, coaching is just teaching. So if you're listening to a kid and you've kind of figured out how they learn, you start, for instance, some kids are visual learners. Some kids have to do it 5, 6, 8 times to do it because they're tangible. Some want to watch film with you. Some you have to work through the barriers of stuff that's going on at home and kind of work through the emotions before they're ready to learn from that standpoint. And I found that's made me better as a pastor, kind of doing the same thing. So what are kind of the emotional, what are the external effects, culture, that are creating barriers to communication and to learning and to common goals, whatever those things might be or what we're working on. But I think that comes from my own sense that by not being able to claim a culture, I've become very curious about my own. So it's kind of helped develop a posture of kind of lifelong learning. So as much as I love learning about myself, I also love learning about others because then I also learn about myself too, I guess. But yeah, I think that's what it's. I can't really claim anything, and so all I can do is learn.
Yeah.
It's exhausting.
No kidding. Well, that's a really helpful frame, Aaron, to hear you talk about that. Last question that I have for you, or last thing I'd like you to talk about is for those of us who have just culture's just given, it's how we see life. We haven't ever been forced to think very deeply about it. Okay. And now, as we're called to lead as Christian public leaders in this time that is so culturally pluralistic, right? There's so many different. I mean, I already navigate multiple cultures, but they're more similar than different. So sometimes I can fake it, right? Now we can't fake it so much, and we have to learn to be bicultural, bilingual. What would be the gifts, or what would be the challenge that you would have, so that we as Christian public leaders could be more of a gift to the world in this time as we move forward?
I think the first thing I'll say is be gracious with yourself. I think what's interesting is, at least in our narrative today, it's when we realize we're part of the dominant culture, there's sort of a shame that gets imposed. Yeah. Some of that's imposed, self-imposed, but some of it's imposed by the culture minority. And we can't, I think we have to just be gracious. You can't change that about yourself. Be gracious. I mean, because I think God is gracious. Hopefully that
leads us to on that one, Aaron, that God's gracious.
But it's true, like how many people are very apologetic. And I mean, people even say that to me as a male, that I need to be apologetic. I'm aware of it. Yeah. And I accept it for what it is, and that it has limitations and that it has strengths as well too. But if you can understand that about yourself and accept that, and I think that's what graciousness is really about. It's about acceptance, but also having understanding and being able to reflect and understand what's true. So it's really acceptance and honesty. Then you can kind of enter into a conversation with people about how do we do bicultural, intercultural dialogue. Mm-hmm. Because if you've been honest with yourself and you can accept what's true about you, mm-hmm. a lot of that fear and insecurity that you have about what the other person's thinking, you just walk into it and you can kind of just worry about yourself, which is interesting because I'll share this, like my IDI came out and I'm on denial. That's where I came out in denial. And so I was talking to Dave Scher about it and like, that's really interesting because that's not where I saw myself, but it makes sense because in some ways unintentionally I've kind of flattened out in that way. I accept what I am. I accept it. I accept I grew up on a farm. It is what it is. It was life-giving to me. There are limitations to how much of Korean culture I understand, but I'm also racially Korean as well too. So seek to understand it. And I think you have to start there with yourself. The church is doing a lot right now, or at least the conversations in society seems to be is we have to completely dismiss ourselves in order to really understand the other. and doesn't make a lot of sense because it's a relationship. So there has to be that, both have to be present. But then the other part, I guess, to go with once you've kind of done that work for yourself is so curiosity. It's curiosity. So like it's interesting, like this uniform, just by wearing this and wearing this and wearing this rank on my, like people can already, they already know what I do. Even the color of this uniform says that I work for a certain type of command or community in the Navy. We don't walk around like that. Most of us don't. So we have to get curious about other people's experience. Asking a lot of good questions and asking, hard questions and being, I think, and really what it boils down is having the courage to do that, to be curious. And that means walking sometimes too, and being, for me, language barrier is the hardest thing. That's what I kind of figure out. That's what really stops me, and that's why I probably don't go too far. You gotta have the courage to push through. That's the wrestling part, right? Some days your guy's smacking you in the face and pulling on your head. You just got to keep going forward and go through it because you know that something good will come out of that struggle. And that makes the most sense. I mean, if our curiosity and our kind of a sense of courageousness kind of is part of who we are, then we have to trust that we're going to get through it okay. Like we have to trust that God will bring us to some semblance of whatever. And, again, that's having the courage really to fail. So it's really those two things: be gracious with yourself and then have the courage to enter in and be okay with failure and struggle. Which is interesting. Most people I've kind of found that's where they get tripped up. They're not honest with themselves and they're not very gracious then with themselves. And then they don't really have the courage to fail really. But I think that's what's so important right now, at least for me. Seem to work at this point. So.
Yeah. Aaron, there's a lot more we could talk about, but I thank you for giving us some time today and for letting us learn from your own experience and really take that challenge to heart as we seek to minister in all the different parts of this country where we'll find ourselves. So thanks, you guys. And I hope this has been helpful.